With historic St. Augustine to our left, driving down Avenida Menendez towards Castillo de San Marcos. To our right, the Matanzas River really wraps around Anastasia Island, which separates St. Augustine from the North Atlantic Ocean. The Castillo de San Marcos in downtown St. Augustine, Florida. And I'm at the old fort in St. Augustine. Hey, wouldn't you like to take a look at this? We did a couple of years ago, and let me show you what it looks like. It is pretty cool. Castillo de San Marcos is Spanish for St. Mark's Castle. Construction on the fort began in 1672, back when Florida was part of the Spanish Empire. The fort was pretty much completed by 1695, but it would have a lot of different alterations, a lot of renovations over the centuries. What began as a Spanish fort later became part of Britain when St. Augustine became the capital of the British East Florida. This would be from 1763 and the Treaty of Paris. And so the fort was renamed and called Fort St. Mark. Then in the Peace of Paris, which was 1783, it was transferred, or Florida was transferred back to Spain, and the name went back to Castillo de San Marcos. In 1821, Florida was ceded to the United States. This was based on a treaty from 1819, and so the name was changed once again, this time to Fort Marion, and this was honoring a hero of the Revolutionary War. It was declared a national monument in 1924. The 20-plus acres was turned over to the United States National Park Service. In 1942, the original name, Castillo de San Marcos, was restored by an act of Congress. Some of its darker past is that it was a military prison in which Seminole Indians were incarcerated, and some other tribes, Apache tribes, and even Geronimo's band of Apache, as well as some of the Southern Cheyenne. St. Augustine, the city, was founded in 1565. The design of the Castillo is a Masonry star fort, and you can see this from some of the aerial photos, which the design of the fort. It's made from a stone called coquina, small shells, ancient shells that are bonded together, and rock, kind of like limestone. Native Americans from the nearby Spanish missions did most of the work, along with some skilled workers. The coquina was quarried over on Anastasia Island. In 1738, they began some renovations and rebuilding, redesigning the fort. The interior rooms were made bigger, deeper. The old wooden ceilings were replaced by vaulted ceilings, and that required the exterior walls to be increased by about 7 feet. Now, the fort did have some history with the American Civil War. In 1861, January of 1861, Florida joined the Confederate States of America and seceded from the Union. Union troops that had been at the fort, they left. In January of 1861, just a few days before Florida seceded, 125 militiamen marched on the fort. The Union soldier that was manning the fort refused to surrender. He was the only one that was there. He was a caretaker, and he was not going to leave it unless he was given a receipt from the Confederacy. And so they gave him a receipt. The fort became part of the Confederacy. General Robert E. Lee was in command of the coastal defenses during that time of South Carolina and Georgia, East Florida. said, hey, the artillery, we need that in other places, and so they removed a lot of it. They left just 5 cannons back to defend what was then Fort Marion. March the 11th, 1862, the Union Army reoccupied the fort. The rest of the time that this fort has existed, up until the time it became just a national park, museum, and place for tourists to come, it was a military prison. It was used after 1875 to house prisoners from the Indian Wars that were out in the western part of the U.S. Native American prisoners were held there, and many of them died there. Very sad. After the Civil War from 1886 to 1887, nearly 500 Apaches were held prisoner there at Fort Marion. In 1898, about 200 soldiers who were deserters from the Spanish-American War were kept prisoner at the fort. In 1924, it was designated as a national monument. Transferred a few years later, in 1933, to the National Park Service. Seeing here are some of the artillery, 3 types of artillery: mortars, howitzers, and cannons. Attackers as well as defenders had access to many types of weaponry. Each one had its own strengths and weaknesses. Cannon was best for shooting far. A mortar used exploding projectiles, and a howitzer was a mix of the two. Battles to conquer a fort often would last a long time. Choosing the right artillery could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Built to defend the city, the Castillo remained a defensive post when ownership changed. And no, this is not a place for cooking barbecue. I wish it was, but this is a furnace, and the furnace fire to this blazed very hot. A team of soldiers prepares hot shot to fire at wooden warships, heating cannonballs until they glow. During a naval attack, one soldier tends the coal fire and loads the cannonballs. After about 30 minutes, other soldiers use tongs to remove the red hot shot and carry it to guns along the seawall. Now, the goal of a hot shot was to set an enemy ship on fire. Although soldiers have never fired hot shot in battle, they drilled for the possibility. The advent of ironclad ships during the Civil War made hot shot furnaces obsolete. If you ever find yourself in Saint Augustine, Florida, or the vicinity, you will want to travel here and tour Castillo de San Marcos, this beautiful fort, this historical fort that dates back hundreds of years and has really served for 205 years of active service under 5 different flags. It's beautifully preserved, some great history, some great things that you can learn here, and we encourage you, when you're near St. Augustine, Florida, to come and to visit. Thanks so much for watching our channel. Thank you for watching, subscribing, sharing, and for joining us on the journey. We appreciate it so very much. The journey is more than just about our trips. It's about a family of friends coming together, and that's you, and that's us. And we're exploring areas, tasting food, seeing sights, and just enjoying time together. And we thank you for that privilege of leading you and being on that journey together. Dios te bendiga, mi amigos.